Imagine a dry cave at the edge of a vanished world. The fire is low. Outside, the night is cold enough to make every exposed finger hurt. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, something moves through the grass. Inside the cave, a small group is eating, but someone has opened a bundle of leaves. Grasshoppers. Larvae. Perhaps beetles, ants, or other small creatures gathered during the day. They are dropped onto hot stones. Their shells crackle. The smell changes as heat reaches them. To us, the scene can feel almost absurd. Why would anyone choose that? But imagine something more important. These people are not looking at the insects the way we do. They are looking at them as food because ancient humans were not simply desperate creatures grabbing anything that moved. They were skilled observers living inside environments where every season rearranged the menu. They knew where water appeared after rain. They knew which roots could be dug up. They knew which animals left tracks near the river. And some groups knew exactly where to find enormous quantities of tiny animals. The archaeological record is full of bones, stone tools, shells, and charcoal. Insects should be everywhere in the story, yet their remains are remarkably difficult to find. So if insects really mattered, where is the evidence? And if ancient people could hunt deer, catch fish, gather nuts, and dig roots, why spend time chasing something with six legs? The answer begins with a problem that every human group eventually faced. Food does not arrive on schedule. And insects may have been one of the most reliable answers to that problem. That sounds simple. It isn't, because once we ask what ancient humans actually gained from insects, the familiar picture of prehistoric survival begins to crack. And the first clue is hiding in something surprisingly small. The obvious explanation is hunger. When a large animal was unavailable, an insect was still an animal. It could be collected without a spear, carried without a pack, and eaten without spending days tracking it. A hunter might spend hours following a deer and come home with nothing. A forager could walk through a flowering meadow and return with hundreds of insects in a short time. In warm seasons, swarms could appear almost like temporary harvests. And some insects came with another advantage. They were already close to the things humans were collecting. Imagine digging into soft soil for a tuber and finding grubs around the roots. Imagine opening a rotten log and discovering larvae underneath. Imagine a tree suddenly alive with ants, or a grassland shimmering with grasshoppers. The food was not hidden behind a dangerous animal. It was sitting inside the landscape. Modern nutritional research also helps explain why such tiny creatures could be worth collecting. Many edible insects contain substantial protein, fat, minerals, and energy. Their bodies are small, but a large harvest can turn many tiny meals into one significant food resource. A deer could feed a group for days, but a successful hunt was uncertain. Insects could be gathered, roasted, dried, or consumed quickly, depending on the species and culture. So perhaps the answer is simply efficiency. But there is a problem. If efficiency was the whole story, why didn't every ancient human group become enthusiastic insect hunters? They didn't. Recent genetic and archaeological research gives us an important warning. In prehistoric Europe, evidence for insect consumption appears limited. Researchers examining dental calculus from hundreds of ancient modern humans found only small traces of insect DNA, suggesting that insect eating there was occasional or incidental rather than a universal staple. That is a crucial clue. The question is not really, why did ancient humans eat insects? And that takes us away from the idea of a single prehistoric diet. There was no ancient menu, there were millions of local menus, each written by climate, landscape, season, technology, and culture, which means the insect itself may not have been the story. Now, picture two human groups living at roughly the same time. Give both groups the same question. What should we eat today? We imagine one universal caveman diet. Meat, fire, roots, maybe berries. But early humans were opportunists. Our closest primate relatives eat insects, and evidence from early hominin diets suggests that insects could have been among the many animal and plant foods available long before agriculture. That does not prove every early human regularly hunted bugs. Our ancestors inherited a body and a behavioral toolkit capable of exploiting small, difficult-to-see foods. Then culture took over. A child watching an older forager collect a certain grub could learn where it lived, when it appeared, how to handle it, and whether it was worth the effort. After enough generations, an insect stopped being a bug and became a named resource with a season, a location, and a method. That sounds obvious, but think about what it means. Food is partly biology and partly memory. A landscape may contain thousands of edible things, yet a human group can only exploit the resources it recognizes. And insects create an especially strange problem because they can be abundant for a few weeks and almost invisible for the rest of the year. So, knowledge becomes everything. Insects also offered something large animals could not: diversity. A forest might provide beetle larvae in one place, honey or bee brood in another, ants near a nest, caterpillars on leaves, and termites after rain. A single landscape could contain dozens of potential animal foods without requiring a dangerous confrontation. If insects were so accessible, why don't we see piles of insect bones at ancient camps? Because most insects leave almost nothing behind. Their bodies are small. Their exoskeletons can break apart, burn, decay, or disappear. Archaeologists are therefore looking for clues that are far less obvious than a butchered animal bone. And one of the most remarkable clues comes from a place humans have been leaving behind for thousands of years: their own waste. Ancient feces sounds like an unpleasant place to look for history. For archaeologists, however, it can be a treasure. In exceptionally dry caves and shelters, human waste can survive as a hardened mass called a coprolite. Inside, researchers may find seeds, fibers, pollen, tiny bones, and fragments of insects that pass through the digestive system. Studies of human coprolites from archaeological sites in the Americas have found insect remains including grasshoppers and cicadas, while other sites contain evidence consistent with ants and termites. The discovery is powerful because a coprolite can answer a question a campsite sometimes cannot. Was this insect merely present, or did somebody eat it? That distinction is everything. Imagine an archaeologist finding a grasshopper wing beside an ancient hearth. It could have blown there. A predator could have carried it. The insect could have died naturally. But when fragments of edible insects appear inside human feces, the possibilities become much narrower. How common was this? A 2024 meta-analysis of human coprolite research in the Americas examined more than 9,000 specimens from dozens of archaeological sites spanning as much as 14,000 years. The researchers reported that about a third of the assemblages contained coprolites with evidence of intentionally consumed edible insects. Their estimates suggested insects made up a small average share of diets overall, around 4%, but that number is more important than it first sounds. 4% does not mean people were living on bugs. It means insects could be a recurring component of a broader survival strategy. And here comes the twist. If insects were merely emergency food, you might expect them to appear only when everything else failed. But archaeological patterns do not always fit that story. Some communities appear to have deliberately targeted insects even when other foods were available. So perhaps the real advantage was not that insects kept humans alive when food disappeared. Perhaps insects helped humans survive because they could switch between food sources faster than their environment could change. And that brings us to a person we can almost picture. Imagine a young forager standing at the edge of a field after rain. The ground is dark. Leaves shine. Birds are everywhere. The forager is not looking for a mammoth. She is watching the grass. A few days earlier, the insects were almost impossible to find. Now they are everywhere. Grasshoppers leap from stems. Small creatures move beneath leaves. The landscape has changed without changing shape. For someone trained to notice these patterns, this is not an annoyance. It is an opportunity. We should be careful here. We cannot reconstruct the name, face, or thoughts of one prehistoric insect collector. But archaeology and ethnography let us see the kind of knowledge such a person would have needed. Knowing that an insect is edible is only the beginning. You need to know when it appears, where it gathers, how to catch it, how to remove dangerous species, how to cook it, and perhaps most importantly, when not to bother. That final skill is easy to underestimate. A food that appears once every 10 years may not be worth teaching children about. A food that appears every wet season could become part of a community's calendar. This is why insect eating can tell us something deeper about ancient intelligence. It required prediction. Rain falls. Plants respond. Insects hatch, birds arrive. Humans follow the sequence. That is a very different picture of primitive survival. Large prey can run away. A swarm cannot hide in the same way. When insects gather in enormous numbers, the balance between hunter and hunted changes. The human does not need to overpower a single powerful animal. The task becomes collection. This helps explain why insect foods can become culturally important rather than embarrassing emergency meals, but it also explains why the evidence varies so dramatically. A culture living where insects are scarce would have little reason to develop this tradition. A culture living where insects appear predictably and abundantly could build an entire seasonal knowledge system around them. And once that happens, something surprising occurs. The insect is no longer merely food, it becomes part of the map of the year. Look across the world and the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Insects have been eaten by human societies in Africa, Asia, Australia, the Americas, and elsewhere. Although the species, seasons, preparation methods, and cultural meanings differ enormously, it suggests something more interesting. Humans repeatedly discovered the same opportunity. Where a landscape produced a large concentration of edible insects, people could turn that biological event into food. Mexico provides a particularly vivid example. Grasshoppers, known as chapulines, have long been collected and eaten in parts of central Mexico, and traditional harvesting can even turn an agricultural pest into a food resource. Think about the reversal. The insect arrives to consume the crop. Humans arrive to consume the insect. Suddenly, the same creature is both threat and harvest. Insects often concentrate energy in places humans already understand: flowering plants, trees, water, soil, nests, and cultivated fields. Their movements can reveal seasonal changes before humans see them directly. Honey is an extreme example. Bees transform nectar into a concentrated food, and humans learned to risk stings to obtain it. Termites offer another. Colonies can produce sudden winged swarms, creating a brief window when enormous numbers become available. Locusts and grasshoppers can behave similarly. The key is not that insects are magically nutritious. The key is concentration. A scattered resource is hard to exploit. A concentrated resource changes the economics. This is also where human cooperation enters the story. A group can divide tasks. One person finds the insects, another gathers them. Someone prepares the fire. Children can participate in collection without facing the danger of hunting large prey. Food gathering becomes social learning. And once knowledge is shared, it becomes culture. But the pattern still has exceptions. Others may have encountered insects constantly but rarely consumed them. So, what decides whether a crawling creature becomes dinner or disgust? The answer may be less about the insect than about the human mind, because the strangest part of this story is not that our ancestors could eat insects. It is that humans can learn to see almost anything as either food or something unthinkable. There is an important exception hiding inside the whole story. Ancient humans did not automatically eat every edible insect they encountered. Some foods were avoided, some required preparation, and some may have been ignored entirely. The recent genomic evidence from ancient Europeans is especially useful here. Researchers found limited insect DNA in dental calculus from hundreds of ancient modern humans, consistent with occasional or incidental consumption over roughly the last 9,000 years. That is very different from the idea that prehistoric Europeans routinely filled their diets with bugs, and even when insect DNA appears. We cannot always tell whether someone deliberately hunted the insect or swallowed it accidentally while eating plants, fruit, or other foods. This uncertainty matters. Archaeology is not a perfect recording device. It is a detective story with missing pages. Preservation favors large bones. Human attention favors dramatic animals. Modern assumptions favor familiar foods. A mammoth leaves a skeleton. A handful of roasted termites may leave almost nothing, so absence of evidence can become misleading, but there is another exception. Danger: not every insect is safe. Some contain defensive chemicals, irritants, toxins, or other compounds that require knowledge and preparation. Ancient foragers did not need modern laboratory labels to learn this. A community could discover through experience which species were safe, which were seasonal, and which should be left alone. It required rules. And rules require memory. The deeper we go, the more this story stops being about strange food. It becomes a story about information. The ancient human who ate an insect was not necessarily making a desperate choice. She may have been following knowledge accumulated before she was born. And that brings us to the final question: why insects? Why did humans repeatedly look at these tiny creatures and decide they belonged in the category of food? The answer is bigger than protein, much bigger. The deepest answer is that ancient humans ate insects because humans evolved to survive by changing the meaning of the landscape. A forest is not just trees. To a trained human, it is roots, berries, nests, honey, larvae, mushrooms, fish, birds, tracks, water, and seasonal signals. A field is not just grass, it can be seeds, tubers, eggs, grasshoppers, caterpillars, and a warning that predators are nearby. It was our ability to notice possibilities. And insects offered one of the purest tests of that ability. They were small enough to ignore, yet they could appear in huge numbers. They were difficult to preserve, yet they could be nutritionally useful. They could be dangerous. Yet communities could learn which ones were safe. People could remember exactly when to look for them. That combination turns insects into something more important than emergency calories. They become flexible calories. And flexibility may have been one of the great secrets of human survival. A drought reduces plant foods, large animals move away, fish become scarce, a cold season shortens the growing period, a fire transforms the landscape. A flood changes the river. A human group with only one preferred food source is trapped by the environment. A group that can switch among dozens of resources has options. This is where the insect suddenly makes sense. It does not need to replace meat. It does not need to replace plants. It only needs to be available when something else is not. That is a very different definition of importance. And the latest evidence from ancient DNA adds another fascinating piece. That restraint is important, the real discovery is subtler. And now look back at the cave. The person beside the fire does not need to think, I am eating an insect because insects are an efficient source of protein. She simply knows the grass changed, the insects appeared. She remembered. She cooked, she ate. The intelligence is hidden inside the ordinary action. It depends on knowing what the world is offering today. That may be why insect eating appears again and again across human history. Not because our ancestors were desperate enough to eat anything, because they were observant enough to notice what everyone else overlooked. And once you see that, the six-legged creature on the ground stops looking like a last resort. It starts looking like a clue to how humans survived at all. Return to that cave. The fire burns lower now. The insects are gone from the hot stones. The group is quiet. Outside, the night remains dangerous, cold, and enormous. Nothing about the scene looks like the beginning of civilization. Because the remarkable thing is not that someone decided to eat a grasshopper. The remarkable thing is that someone had already learned that this particular creature was worth noticing. Someone had watched the seasons. Someone had remembered where the insects appeared. Someone had learned which ones were safe. Someone had taught someone else. And that knowledge survived even though the insect itself left almost no trace. Tiny clues, tiny meals, huge consequences. Maybe that is the final irony, but survival was also the ability to look down, to notice what was moving beneath the leaves, to recognize that when the world changed, food had not necessarily disappeared. It had simply become smaller. And perhaps that is why the ancient human-eating insects should not make us ask, how desperate were they? It should make us ask something harder. Because the difference between something disgusting and something edible may never have been the creature itself. It may have been knowledge. And that is a very human kind of survival. And the lesson is the simplest. When the obvious food disappeared, our ancestors did not search for something bigger. Sometimes they searched differently. They watched the ground. They waited for the season. And they learned that survival could arrive on six legs.